The Murder of Roger Ackroyd is a classic mystery for a very good reason. Within its pages, Agatha Christie has crafted a masterful story of misdirection and murder. Now I think if we take a page out of Poirot's book and use our little gray cells, I think we can begin to understand why this novel is so brilliant and how it captures its reader's attention and holds it until the very end. In order to break down this novel and show how it works, I originally intended to organize all the data I could find in the novel into webs that showed the connections between characters and clues over time. The trouble was that there was just too much information. These were all of the note cards that I used to write down things while I was reading the book for the second time, and there are 50 clues here, along with quite a few character deduction and major plot point cards. So I tried laying them all out, and mostly what I got was a massive stacked up mess. There was just too much data. But the process did allow me to start seeing some trends, so I decided to treat these cards as data. So this is what this looks like all drawn out. We've got the major events of the story lined up down here. These don't map to chapters, they're just major turning points, and I use those to track everything over time. So we've got 3 very bright colored lines and a blue line. The bright colored lines are the ones that are tracking the data points that I collected. The first green line is our characters, so as you can see, we get most of our characters right at the very beginning of the story. The only ones that come later are Ursula here and Charles Kent here. He is technically in the story earlier on, but he's not really relevant until he gets arrested and becomes a suspect. And then our orange line is our clues, and as you can see, we get most of those in the first half of the story, like right here. We know most everything that we're going to know by the time we get halfway through. It really trails off in the latter half of the story. We get a little bit of new information, but not a whole lot. And this includes a really broad variety of things. This is things like the ring, the shoe prints on the windowsill, the fingerprints on the dagger. This is the different places that the characters were during the murder. You know, it's all of that information. And then this last line, the yellow line, is Poirot's deductions, and we get one kind of here, but mostly they're in the middle to later sections of the book. And what these do is they just help us to better understand what's happening. Poirot already knows what's going on, and these deductions are just him kind of bringing us in on that information. He's letting us know what's going on. This other line really has the opposite trend, and this line's a little bit different than the others because this is one that I went back and created after I had input all of my data points. I took each event and the section after it leading up to the next event, and I rated each one on a scale of 1 to 10 for its level of intrigue, how well it grabs the reader's attention and draws them in, and how much it recontextualizes the information we've already been given. And it really has an upward trend. We do start off at a 5 because this is where Mrs. Ferrars dies. That bit of information, that kind of weird, curious opening, which is, you know, draws your attention because you're like, why is Mrs. Ferrars' death at the beginning of the book when this is the murder of Roger Ackroyd? And this peak that you see here that's kind of unusual in this line is actually the recontextualization of Mrs. Ferrars' death. This is the letter and the conversation with Dr. Shepard that lets us in on the fact that Mrs. Ferrars killed her husband and was being blackmailed, and the fact that her suicide is going to be the catalyst for everything else that comes next. So that's the one peak. The rest of it trends upwards here, and 2 good examples of this are the wedding ring that's found very early on over here, which gets recontextualized when we find out that Ralph is married to Ursula. Now we know why the ring was in the pond, but that section that tells us about the marriage between Ursula and Ralph also completely recontextualizes how we understand Ralph's absence. At first it seems suspicious. He seems like he's guilty because why else would he be hiding? But now, at this later part of the story, we know that it's not because he's guilty, but because he knows that people will think that he's guilty, and he doesn't want them to either suspect his wife or for her reputation to be ruined because of people suspecting him. So that completely changes our understanding of his motivations. The other example is that early on we get this timeline of when Ackroyd could have died because somebody heard him talking at 9:30, and then Flora was seen exiting the study at 9:45. But over here we find out that Flora never saw her uncle, that she was stealing from him, and she pretended to come out of the study to cover up her tracks. So now we know that he could have died earlier than 9:45, and then a little while later we find out about the dictaphone, which tells us that in fact he could have died earlier than 9:30. So our whole timeline, our whole understanding of how things happened has to change. And that's what this line represents, is that this happens more and more throughout the end of the story. And because of that, this story has two major peaks. It has this section where we know everything, and this section where we understand everything. And I think that that's the genius of the Murder of Roger Ackroyd.